Tonight, new fallout from the Mueller hearings. A former federal prosecutor joins us to look at where the investigations and hearings might go from here. Then what do Democrats do next? ABC News political director Rick Klein joins us with the answer. Also, instead of dealing with election security, there's insecurity about the issue on Capitol Hill. We'll explain. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman in for Richard French. President Trump is still tweeting about yesterday's Mueller hearings. The president quoting hosts of Fox and Friends who are blasting Mueller, slamming Democrats, and of course, declaring victory. Tonight we're going to play some of the highlights of those hearings yesterday, and then we'll speak with a former federal prosecutor. Now, as we all know, President Trump has been saying since the report came out that it totally cleared him, total exoneration. Jerry Nadler, the Democrat from New York who chairs the Judiciary Committee, asked Robert Mueller about that yesterday, and Mueller directly contradicted the president.
The report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
No total exoneration. Then we get to these next two clips. They're also making a lot of headlines.
Could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
Ethically, under the ethical standards?
Well, I'm not certain because I haven't looked at the ethical standards, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless he can continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
And then there's Val Demings from Florida also getting a lot of attention for this exchange.
It is fair to say then that there were limits on what evidence was available to your investigation of both Russia election interference and obstruction of justice.
That's true, and it's usually the case.
And that lies by Trump campaign officials and administration officials impeded your investigation.
I would generally agree with that.
There is a lot to dissect and digest, more than perhaps you might have thought when the hearings ended yesterday. For that, we turn to former federal prosecutor Benjamin Allee. I spoke with him earlier this afternoon. So, Benjamin, before we get into the content of Mueller's testimony, everybody's talking about his performance, which reminded me of something that I learned when I first started covering court cases in trial. That is, most people go to court, they expect to see Law and Order or A Few Good Men or the TV and movie version. The reality tends to be a lot less exciting, which seems to me what we got yesterday. Tell me about the dangers of focusing only on the theatrics when you're looking at what's going on in a courtroom or a hearing room, as opposed to the content.
Well, you're right. There are dangers to focusing on theatrics. What matters really ultimately is the substance. And yesterday there was some substance, but as we learned, most of it or almost all of it had been revealed previously in the written report. And so yesterday what we got was the congressional testimony version, the oral version of what was written down in 400 pages by Mueller and his team.
Was it your sense yesterday that Mueller was bound by constraints, whether they were self-imposed or that warning from the DOJ not to go beyond the four corners of the report, and that affected his performance? Or do you think it was just an aging and sort of very busy witness?
Well, I think his performance can be described with a few factors, or should be considered in light of a few factors. So the first is he is not a witness to the events in question. He did not witness meetings with Russia. He did not hear conversations about what to do about the investigation about Russian interference. He was the prosecutor. And so in that role, yes, he is limited. So Robert Mueller could not talk about grand jury material. He could not talk about classified material. He could not talk about pending cases. He could not talk about open investigations. And he could not say anything that would state or imply the guilt of anyone who was not charged or not convicted. So that's a very limited situation for a person like Robert Mueller, and he dealt with those constraints, yesterday in his testimony.
And so he was trying to tiptoe through them to a certain extent?
Whether he was tiptoeing, it's hard for me to say if he was tiptoeing. That's possible, but I do think he was careful not to violate any of those numerous parameters that he had.
And toward that end, you mentioned as we prepared for the conversation that Trump had gotten some major breaks during the course of the investigation, one of them being that he was a special prosecutor. there were some others, including the impact that OLC opinion had on him.
Yes. So there are several ways that I think the president is lucky to be where he is right now. One of them is that there's an opinion two opinions combined from 1973 and from 2000 from a place called the Office of Legal Counsel. The conclusion or the result of the opinion is a sitting president cannot be indicted. Mueller and his team are essentially bound by that opinion. That's very fortunate for President Trump. He's lucky in another way, in my view, which is that Robert Mueller was the person who oversaw this investigation, that Mueller was very careful not to say a conclusion about whether Donald Trump broke the law. He went so far as to say, we would exonerate him if we could. Mm-hmm. We would give a beneficial conclusion for the president, but he would not give the contrary conclusion. And then when you read the rest of it, you realize, of course, what's laid out there is a case for obstruction of justice.
It's particularly frustrating for critics of the president because so much of what was being examined was in the process of him becoming president. And so, for example, the Michael Cohen payoffs to Stormy Daniels actually directly impacted the election process, which then provides him with this protection that the OLC affords him now.
Of course. So the idea being he became president upon this problematic conduct, yes, arguably criminal conduct. And so there's a terrible irony there. There's a worse irony, which is it's hard to imagine President Trump, were he in Mueller's position, bending over backwards in the same way to demonstrate such integrity.
And it certainly incentivizes him to do everything he can to win re-election, because then he gets the protections extended for another 4 years. What stood out to you from yesterday's hearing?
A couple things stood out to me. The first is that it was a reminder of very important facts and conclusions that came from Mueller's investigation. And they're not new yesterday, but they came in this new medium of congressional testimony. One of them, and the first one, is there was an attack on our country in 2016. It was an attack on our electoral system, and it was an attack by a foreign power. Another one is that the Trump presidential team, the election team at the time, knew about that. They were secretly aware of it, and they rooted for it, and they hoped to benefit from it. And then the third conclusion that the Mueller team drew, if you read the second volume of their report carefully, is that there were several specific instances of obstruction into the investigation into those first two things, the interference.
Mueller also said yesterday that the president could face charges once he left office, but that's like so much of what we've heard from Robert Mueller, it leads to a difference of opinion. Some are taking that as Mueller saying that Trump should face charges, that he's committed a crime or may have committed a crime and should face charges once he leaves office. Others are taking it as, well, it's possible that any president could face criminal charges after they leave office. I'm wondering which takeaway you came away with.
I take Robert Mueller at his word. I think he means that in the most basic way you can say that, which is, literally speaking, when he is no longer president, the Office of Legal Counsel opinion that prevents charging him or indicting him while president no longer applies. At that point, he could be charged. I don't view that as a commentary by Robert Mueller on whether he would charge him at that moment. I think he was careful to say at the beginning of the latter part of his testimony that he was not opining on that question.
We know that the Southern District of New York and other U.S. attorneys still have cases or investigations going against Donald Trump. The Southern District of New York includes the inauguration and how money got to the inaugural committee and what was done with it. How worrisome for Trump can those cases be, and are those cases at all impacted by what we saw from Robert Mueller yesterday?
I think on the first point, anyone in that position, anyone who is a subject or is entangled in a federal investigation in the Southern District of New York should be worried. This investigation is worrisome for additional reasons. It involves over $100 million that was put into the inaugural fund for President Trump. There was a subpoena that went out from the Southern District of New York earlier this year for all or nearly all of the records of the inaugural committee regarding those donations and then the use of those donations. And there is a potential cooperating witness, at least one in that case. Rick Gates has been publicly disclosed as a cooperating witness, and he was a key figure in the inauguration committee and its expenditure of funds. That's very worrisome.
There were a number of questions yesterday brought up by Republicans that the lack of an underlying crime, in this case conspiracy with Russia, negates the possibility of obstruction of justice. And I know that you disagree with that take.
I do. So as a factual matter, we all, as Americans, should want to know what happened with the interference in our election, including whether a crime was committed or not, just what happened there. But as to the second question about obstruction of justice, it is beside the point whether the person charged with obstruction committed the underlying crime that they later tried to interfere with the investigation of. And it's also beside the point whether there's evidence to prove the underlying crime. So a person who obstructed with an investigation can be charged with that, whether or not it can be proved that they committed the underlying case, or even whether or not they did the underlying crime.
It's not obstruction of justice investigating a crime, it's just obstruction of justice. Finally, this investigating the investigators, as a lot of Republicans sort of focused on yesterday, I'm curious, did you share any of their concerns about the underlying foundations of the Mueller probe before yesterday? Did yesterday change your opinion at all? Do you think justice should be investigating the investigators?
Yesterday did not change my view on that. There are some instances where there are legitimate questions about an investigation. And so one example would be the investigation that led to the prosecution of Ted Stevens, which was a little over 10 years ago. That got scrutinized very carefully by the Department of Justice.
What's the difference? That verdict was overturned?
Well, there was ultimately no verdict there, and the scrutiny initially came from the judge in that case. But I give it as an example because it is a counterpoint. There were legitimate, unbiased reasons to question that investigation. There are also biased reasons by the defense, but ultimately unbiased from the court and from outside observers that led to some scrutiny of that prosecution. None of that is present here. These are career government officials. They're acting in good faith. There are legitimate charges brought. People were convicted. The rule of law prevailed. There's no concern that's unbiased or neutral that there was a problem in that process. The concerns are coming from, as far as I can tell, personal or political motivations. That's not a good reason to mischaracterize or over-scrutinize career justice employees.
Benjamin Allee is a former federal prosecutor. Mr. Allee, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
And up next, we just discussed the legal aspects of Mueller's testimony. After the break, we shift to the political fallout.